Unlock the high returns of the expanding venture capital world right here on the Emerging Managers Podcast.
Scott, I am so excited. We are finally doing this.
Me too.
Emerging Managers Podcast. Going to talk about emerging funds. And really, I mean, you are the expert in this. Scott Kelly, Black Dog Ventures. I mean, gosh, I think we've known each other about almost a decade.
Yeah, at least. Absolutely.
Yeah. So you're Scott Kelly. I'm Tracy Hazzard, in case you didn't hear that on our intro. But we are going to talk about the new podcast, Emerging Managers. Scott, what made you want to do this?
Well, it's interesting because I've been working on the entrepreneur side, working with entrepreneurs to get exposure to potential investors. And then, you and I have been talking for years at this point about putting together a podcast, and I really couldn't find the right topic. And then something hit me towards the end of last year. There was an article came out that got a lot of press, a lot of play about the amount of capital going into venture capital funds and the fact that 70, 80% of the money going into venture capital funds went to only 12 to 15 funds. And I looked at that in the landscape of 3,200 venture capital funds and 1,800 fund ones, brand new managers. And I saw, okay, there's a gap there. And as I was talking to some of these managers, they are really good at managing the portfolio and picking the portfolio companies. And honestly, the alpha, the return on these smaller funds is historically better than these large funds. So why aren't they getting more LPs involved? Why aren't they getting more exposure? Why aren't they getting the recognition they deserve?
I thought that was such an astounding number, just to think that 1,800 of them were at Fund One. I mean, that's more than half.
Exactly.
That seemed crazy to me. But at the same time, I think it makes a lot of sense that there's a lot of money floating around and everyone's looking at their niche and their area of expertise. And they are way better at picking the startups. They are way better at picking the investment.
Exactly. What I found is that a number of them, I'll kind of use it as a sports analogy. Some of them were really good as angel investors. The equivalent of being good at high school or college baseball, and then they got really good and decided to move to the big leagues and start a fund. And I think they got really good at managing the investments, making the picks, but the reality is they just don't have enough capital and enough awareness to be effective to as many startups as they can. That's
really interesting. Now, you have quite the network. So over the years, I want people to hear where you started from and, how this has emerged into this. But when I first met you, you were running these pitch events, and it was like, the short pitches at a bigger event. Like that's what you were plugging in. And then eventually you had your own events. Tell us how all of that came about.
Well, I've been an investor and entrepreneur for 30 plus years. I worked on Wall Street. I worked in Silicon Valley. And about 13 years ago, I went to a pitch event, and frankly, it was terrible as an attendee. These were entrepreneurs speaking to people that, with respect, were real estate agents, insurance agents, and teachers. They may have given good advice, maybe, but they had never invested in a company, a private company. And I decided that had to change. And,
so you saw a combination of both sides of it, right? Like the startups weren't pitching really well, and the feedback loop in the investment group wasn't really well matched either.
Exactly. So, I launched VC Fast Pitch about 13 years ago, and, I decided to change the model. I don't have an application process for the entrepreneurs. I don't vet the entrepreneurs. I vet the investors, because at the end of the day, if you're going to spend time, money, travel, whatever the case, to get in front of an investor, you might as well be in front of an investor. And it's interesting. I did an interview for our podcast today with a good friend of mine now. His name is Tim Holliday. He came to my event 11 years ago in Phoenix, Arizona, when he was an entrepreneur with his startup. He pitched for 1 minute. After lunch, after he pitched, he got pulled over by an investor who actually 3 weeks later gave them their first check at dinner up in Palo Alto, California, did a $3 million round the next year, and then sold their company and then moved from entrepreneur to running a startup venture capital fund called Space Station Investments, which has 109 portfolio companies. So, that was really kind of the lightning rod, to move towards this podcast. Is that I think, I've done deals for 30 years. I've got 13,000 plus investors that I've done some kind of transaction with over that time. And venture capital funds struggle with a lot of similar things that startups do.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting. So you and I met, and you had asked me, because you did this event and I was press at the event. Technically, I was both a writer for Inc. magazine and a podcast host, and I was doing both at the same time, and I had my own startup. So it was kind of all of the interesting areas, and we meet, and I was fascinated by the fast pitch model. But the reason why, when you and I started to strike up a conversation, I was fascinated by connecting up with you, was because your investors weren't hidden. So often at these events, they don't announce them. You have no idea who they are, what their interests are. You don't know anything about them. And it always made me wonder whether or not I was just giving away my intellectual property. Like, was this on the up and up? Was this even real? Right. And you made that so upfront, and right, a major part of the event was to get to know both sides. We were going to get to know the startups because they're on the stage, but you let us get to know that audience, that panel of investors. And I thought that was really eye-opening. So I do think you really changed the model there, Scott, and I loved that about what you were doing. But another thing that you do that I think is really relevant to this podcast too, is you connect up service providers too that could help not only the startups, but sometimes the investors, and help them with their funds and help them with the management of everything. And whether it's, deal room creation and legal funds and other things like that you might need, you bring them all into the model. And that's how I ended up. I spoke at one of your local events here in Orange County, California, and, did a talk about marketing, because that's, obviously both fund and startup needs to market themselves. Exactly. So they have to understand what some of those ways that build trust a little better. And that was what my first talk was about with you. Yeah. So I think that's really interesting that you chose that model.
Well, I appreciate that. Well, the reality is that, it's purposeful networking. It's purposeful dialogue. I'm an A-type personality. I'm a New Yorker, and so I want to get to the getting. And I
knew that's why I liked you, because I'm a New Yorker too, right? Well, I'm a Connecticut girl, but still close enough.
But apologies for that. No, kidding. But the reality is, you and I both been to these large conferences where maybe you get an Instagram photo with Mark Cuban, but you don't really talk to Mark Cuban or anybody else who actually has the ability to write a check. And, we kept our events, max out at maybe 200 people, because then you get the dialogue. You're not caught up in this mass hysteria. Again, large conferences have value and have purpose, but, we are very purposeful. We don't bring in a lot of sponsors because the reality is, with respect, nobody wants to listen to them. They want to hear from the entrepreneurs, and they want to hear from the investors. And that's really been the focus, of our events.
Well, and the other thing that you do, which is why I thought when you told me that you were going to do this podcast, I was really excited for it. One of the things that you do at the end of your events, whether it's virtual or live, you ask the investors questions, and it's the turn for the startup to be able to ask some questions as well as you ask some. And I always love the questions that are like, what are you reading? And, what podcasts are you listening to? And just some of those things about where they're getting their information and insight tells you a lot about them.
Yep.
That you wouldn't get elsewhere.
Yeah, at the end of every event, we do our fireside chat, and I tell, at our in-person events, I tell all the investors, turn your chair around. And they turn their chair around. We did an event. It was like a campfire at our last event in St. Petersburg. We had this big circle of people, and everyone stuck around, and the investors stick around, and I'm so grateful. If you think about this, these are people that are managing millions to hundreds of millions to possibly billions of dollars. And, in our in-person event, they're there at 9 o'clock in the morning and they stay straight through 5 o'clock, which I think is, a testament to, their desire, to be in front of entrepreneurs.
Well, you have got quite the lineup here for the podcast already, because we've got tons of investors to talk to, and fund managers and of all levels and all different types to talk about from all over the country too, and international.
Absolutely.
So, I think one of the first ones I heard was from Canada. So you've got
exactly.
Fund managers from everywhere, which I really am really excited about. But the thing that I'm most interested in is, what are you going to be able to do different because you don't have the event? You don't have pitching going on in front of them. What are you going to be able to ask them that's different? What are you diving into?
Well, the things I want to know is I want an origin story of how they became an investor. A lot of investors start out as struggling entrepreneurs eating ramen. So I want to share first the origin story. Then obviously I want to learn things about their thesis, why they invest, how they invest, what the attributes of the investment is. But a lot of times I want to know, the main question I ask a lot of them is, why your fund and why now? And I think, in a field of thousands of venture capital funds, investors want to know where they should put their money and why choose this venture capital fund versus another, this angel fund versus another, because the reality is that there's a lot of white noise out there. There is you get these large, the big companies on Sand Hill Road get all the press
and dominate the conversation to the point that everybody thinks that has to be the thesis. And
exactly.
That's not necessarily the case. That's why these other funds are outperforming in some areas, right? I think that also what it does is, and this is why a manager needs to be on your show, is that there has to be a trust building level that happens when you're in fund one. You don't have a track record to go on. So
exactly.
It has to build trust from somewhere. And I think that those investors who decide that they're going to stay anonymous and behind the scenes, and like you've never heard of them before, they don't have a LinkedIn profile, those maybe aren't the ones for you here. Sure. I think the ones that want to be known are the ones who have the opportunity to move up to the next tier of investment fund.
Right. Exactly. That's the same thing. Obviously, entrepreneurs struggle with that. The reality is, a lot of, VC funds and investors, won't trust a first-time founder because they don't know anything about them. And in some cases, they'll summarily reject them for that same reason. And the interesting thing I found is that people are doing that with venture capital funds. And so they have that struggle of, we're competent, we're good at what we do, but I need to convince you or build a trust relationship with you. So you are going to take your high risk capital or that portion of your portfolio and invest it with our fund.
So interesting. No, so a while ago, I thought it must be at least 6 years ago or something, I heard Bill Kelly speak, and he was one of the original founders of WebMD. And he was a founder of one of the pieces that became WebMD when they consolidated all the parts, right? And he called the investment model a sacred trust. And I always loved that idea that you put in that concept in head, that it's a sacred trust between the startup and the fund, or the startup and the investor, or whether they're angel or whatever level they are. And that trust has to have a certain amount of disclosure, a certain amount of understanding on both sides, a certain amount of mission and alignment, background alignment. And it's hard sometimes to get off of I'm giving a presentation as a startup and get into the get to know the other side mode.
Right. Well, I think the reality is, I've been in sales, my entire life. I trained 1,000 salespeople, in my career, probably more than that. And the reality is, people do business with people they like and people they trust and people they know. And so if you can get through those three things, your ability and your aptitude to be successful just increases.
I love that. Well, let's talk about some of the people that are coming on, like some of
Sure.
the types of funds and the areas you're going to cover. What are you looking at?
Well, we've got at least, well, dozens already scheduled. I've already interviewed, Tim at Space Station Investments, which I told you about. Top Down Ventures. These were entrepreneurs that built a really solid business in the MSP space, the managed service provider space, and had several exits in the space. So they took what they did in that industry and became investors in that industry. So they have, implicit knowledge of that. I'm really excited about, it's ironic we're taping this right after the Super Bowl where there was a record number of betting on the game. We've got Jake from Better Capital who invests in gaming companies, and it's a niche, and we have a lot of those interesting folks. A good friend of mine, Brian McMahon from Expert Dojo. He's not shy and he's all over the place. But the reality is he's going to be a great interview because he comes at it from a really interesting perspective. And that's just the beginning. We've got, like I said, we've got investors from Silicon Valley, from the Southeast. We've got some really good Midwest investors. I did an interview with somebody who was, from Cincinnati, and we had a really interesting conversation about why invest in the Midwest? And the obvious conversation came up as well. The valuations are a lot cheaper than San Francisco or New York. And so, we'll have a lot of good perspective, from all kinds of, emerging investors.
I love that. Well, of course, why not? We need investment from all over. I think that's also something that, I don't know the statistic on that as well, but I would imagine when you talk about only those, top funds getting all the funds, they're all in Silicon Valley, so it skews the geographic location of the funding as well, right? Just by that.
And the other thing interesting is that, the same struggle in venture capital funds is the same struggle that certain groups in startup space have. We're going to have some minority managers. We'll have female fund managers because, again, not only do the startups in those demographics suffer, as you compared to everybody else, so do fund managers. So the reality is, it's we are going to be we're going to be Switzerland in our approach.
I think that's really great. Well, why am I here? And I think my role is going to be to sort of sometimes define some things that maybe the startups didn't know or understand about the process and sort of give that, I'm going to call it that startup perspective recap, because I come from the world of innovation and entrepreneurship. And I think, gosh, my $2 billion of consumer product goods. So I'd say consumer products, I probably have a greater dollar value in terms of experience in. But I've been running a tech startup for, we're hitting on our 7th year. We just had our 7th year anniversary. So,
and absolutely, the reality is, obviously, when I decided to come to this podcast, you were call number one for very obvious reasons. Your background in the podcast space is second to none. But you're right. You bring a really interesting perspective. Obviously, you are a successful female entrepreneur. I not only say that because it's obvious, not because it's necessarily an issue one way or the other, but you also do have that perspective. And I think sometimes, for me, I'm dealing from the connector standpoint. And it's important that we get the perspective of not just people investing the money, but the people hoping to receive the investment.
Well, and we should, in full disclosure here, Scott is an investor in Podetize, our company, and we have worked together on raising funds, which I've never taken. I actually didn't end up taking it. We've had offers, we've turned them down. We just decided to go a little bit different model of it, and mainly because I had some long-term, like 20 years ago, had experience with angel investors that was not as good as it could have been. And so
Sure.
I may be a little bit hampered by that. So
Right.
I always also look at the investment model as how much of that can I trust as a startup, as an entrepreneur? How much
Right.
is this going to be a good relationship and mentorship for me as well? So
Right.
I think that that's going to be kind of an interesting viewpoint, is to take a look at that. Our goal is to bring that at the very end as our payout as to
Yep.
what our final thoughts are, and not mess with the interview in any way, shape, or form. Sometimes Scott will do the interviews, sometimes I'll do them, sometimes we'll do them together, but we'll always catch back up and do a little recap. And if for some reason we didn't, if you reach out to us on social media, one of us will be happy to give our thoughts on social for you. So, neither one of us are shy about giving
Yeah,
our ideas.
there's not a lack of opinion on this podcast for sure.
That's right. So if for some reason you didn't hear an opinion about something that you would like to hear, you just reach out to us and we will get that to you.
Absolutely.
So, well, I'm looking forward to this, Scott.
Me too.
This would be I think it's my 8th podcast technically that I've ever done in the last, it'll have to be 11 years. So, and I swore to myself I wasn't going to do another one. I swore to my partner I wasn't going to do another one because he said no. But your model sucked me in.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you.
So I hope you listeners out there are as excited as Scott and I are to bring you the show, Emerging Managers Podcast. Tune in every week, everywhere you listen to podcasts. Scott, final words?
Final words is that we want to make sure that the best managers get the best opportunity to talk to the best opportunities.
I love that. We're going to uncover VC funds that are the next great investment fund.
Absolutely.
Join Scott Kelly, Tracy Hazzard, and their high-performing capital fund manager guests next week on the Emerging Managers Podcast. Don't miss our upcoming virtual and live VC Fast Pitch and podcast events. For more details, background on our guests, or an application to be our next guest, visit emergingmanagerspodcast.com. Don't miss out on shaping the future of venture capital and entrepreneurship with us by joining our robust community of innovators and investors today.